The shovel struck frozen earth with a sound like breaking bones. Margaret Caldwell's hands were blistered raw, blood seeping through the cloth she'd wrapped around her palms, but she didn't stop. The hole had to be 6 feet deep. That was the law. That was decency. That was what you owed the dead, even when the dead man had tried to kill you 3 hours earlier. The November wind cut across the Montana territory like a blade, carrying snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. Margaret's dark hair, usually pinned tight, hung loose around her face, tangled with dirt and sweat despite the cold. Her wedding dress, if you could call it that, just a simple gray wool she'd worn to the courthouse 2 months ago, was torn at the hem and stained with mud and blood. Always blood on the frontier. She glanced at the body wrapped in canvas beside the hole. Thomas Caldwell. Her husband. The man who'd promised her protection. A new start. A life away from the factories back east where girls like her disappeared into machines and were forgotten. The man who'd put his hands around her throat that morning when she'd refused him for the last time. Let's go back. Not 24 hours further. To understand what happened that night, you need to know how Margaret Caldwell became the kind of woman who could bury her own husband and break every rule doing it. 3 months earlier, Margaret stepped off the stagecoach in Sweetwater Creek with everything she owned in a single trunk. She was 26, which made her practically an old maid by frontier standards. But she was strong, literate, and desperate. 3 qualities that made her exactly what Thomas Caldwell was looking for. He'd placed an advertisement. Widower seeks capable woman. Must be willing to work. No romance required. The honesty appealed to her. Romance had gotten her sister killed back in Philadelphia, pregnant and abandoned by a man who'd sworn his love. Margaret had learned that lesson early. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Thomas met her at the station, a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to calculate everything. His ranch sat 10 miles outside town, accessible only by a rutted path that tested every bolt in his wagon. I had a wife before, he said on that first ride, not looking at her. She died in childbirth, baby too. That was 3 years back. I'm sorry, Margaret replied, because that's what people said. Don't be. I'm not looking to replace her. Just need someone who can cook, clean, help with the cattle when needed. You'll have your own room. I'll leave you be. In exchange, you get a roof, food, and protection. Fair trade? Margaret had nodded. Fair trade. What he hadn't mentioned was that his nearest neighbor was 7 miles away, that the town marshal came through maybe twice a year. That out here, a woman alone with a man made her own rules or suffered under his. The first month was exactly as promised. Thomas was distant, practical, methodarily. He rose before dawn, worked until dusk, ate whatever she cooked without complaint, and disappeared into the small room he'd built onto the side of the cabin. Margaret had the main bedroom. The door had a lock on her side. She appreciated that more than she could say. Margaret learned the rhythms of frontier life quickly. How to stretch beans and salt pork across a week. How to read weather in the behavior of cattle. How to shoot the Winchester Thomas kept above the door. In case of wolves, he'd said, though they both knew he meant the 2-legged kind. The isolation suited her. After the crowded tenements of Philadelphia, the endless space felt like breathing after years underwater. She'd stand on the porch at sunset watching the sky turn colors that had no names and think, this is peace. She should have known peace never lasts. The change came gradually like seasons turning. Thomas started lingering at breakfast, watching her move around the kitchen. His comments shifted from practical to personal. You've got strong hands for a woman. Your hair looks better down. My first wife, she was always cold at night. You ever get cold? Margaret kept her responses brief, professional. She'd seen this before, men who started with compliments and ended with demands. But out here there was nowhere to run. One night in October he didn't go to his room, just sat in the chair by the fire cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. I've been thinking, Thomas said, not looking at her. This arrangement, it's not natural. Man and woman under one roof, living like strangers. People in town are talking. Margaret's hand stilled over the mending in her lap. What people say doesn't matter. It does when they start questioning whether you're really my wife or just some woman I'm keeping. Start wondering what that makes you. The threat was clear. In a town where reputation was everything, being labeled a prostitute, even falsely, could mean exile or worse. We had an agreement, Margaret said carefully. Agreements change. Thomas set down the rifle. I'm not an unreasonable man, Margaret. I'm just saying maybe it's time we made this arrangement more traditional, proper. No. The word hung in the air like gun smoke. Thomas's jaw tightened. He stood slowly, walked to where she sat, and placed his hand on her shoulder. Not violent, not yet. Just heavy. Think about it, he said quietly. Out here a woman needs protection. I can provide that, but I need something in return. He left her sitting there, trembling, understanding that the lock on her bedroom door meant nothing if the man who owned the house decided to break it down. If you were Margaret, what would you do? You're 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. The town marshal hasn't been seen in months. The only law is what men make up as they go. Leave a comment below. Would you run, fight, or submit? Because what Margaret chose next would determine everything. She chose to prepare. The next day, while Thomas worked the far pasture, Margaret took stock. She had the Winchester, but Thomas kept the ammunition locked in his room. She had a kitchen knife, but knives required closeness she couldn't afford. She had her intelligence, her strength, and the certainty that she would not become another frontier woman who disappeared into silence. She started small, hid supplies, dried meat, matches, a canteen in the barn, studied the paths away from the ranch, memorizing landmarks, wrote a letter explaining everything and sealed it with wax, addressed to the territorial marshal in Helena. But most importantly, she paid attention. Watched how Thomas moved, where he was careless, when he drank too much whiskey and grew sloppy. She had no illusions. If it came to violence, he was stronger. But she was smarter. And she was fighting for something he'd never understand, the right to say no and have it mean something. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after his proposal. Thomas had been drinking the night before, not drunk, but loose enough to be bold. He cornered Margaret in the kitchen while she was kneading bread. I've been patient, he said, standing too close. More patient than most men would be, but this can't continue. Tonight you're going to move your things into my room. This arrangement ends. No. Margaret's hands didn't stop working the dough. Our agreement was specific. You violated it. I'm leaving, Thomas laughed, a sound without humor. Leaving? To go where? You've got no money, no horse of your own, and winter's coming. You'd die before you reach town. Then I'll die free. His hand shot out, grabbed her wrist. The grip was iron. You think you're special? You think you get to make demands out here? There's no law but what I say. No rules but mine. You're my wife on paper, and that paper says you belong to me. Margaret looked him in the eye. Let go. Or what? She brought her knee up hard between his legs. As he doubled over, gasping, she grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with everything she had. The sound it made hitting his skull was like a church bell. One clear, decisive note Thomas dropped. Margaret stood over him, breathing hard, the skillet still in her shaking hands. For a long moment, Thomas didn't move, and she thought, I've killed him, and now they'll hang me for it. But then he groaned, rolled onto his side, reached for her ankle. She hit him again, and again, and again, until her arms burned and her vision blurred, and something inside her that had been tightly wound finally, terribly broke free. When she stopped, Thomas was unconscious, blood pooling dark against the wooden floor. Margaret dropped the skillet. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely stand. This is it, she thought. This is where your story ends. Because she'd just assaulted her legal husband. In the eyes of the law, what little law existed out here, she was the criminal. He could claim self-defense, insanity, a dozen excuses, but her? She was just a woman who'd stepped out of line. Unless, the thought formed slowly, terribly, inevitably, unless there was no one to tell the story but her. Margaret dragged Thomas outside. He was heavy, God, he was heavy. But adrenaline and terror made her strong. She got him to the barn, tied him with rope she used for the horses, and locked him inside. Then she sat on the porch and tried to think. Her mind raced through options like shuffling cards. Run. Take his horse. What supplies she could carry. Disappear into the territory. But winter was coming, and a woman alone on the frontier wouldn't last a week. Wait for him to wake and try to reason with him. But men like Thomas didn't reason. They retaliated, or the third option was unspeakable. It was the kind of thing that separated humans from animals, the kind of thing that, once done, couldn't be undone. But as Margaret sat there listening to Thomas beginning to stir in the barn, She realized something. She'd already crossed a line. The moment she'd fought back, she'd become something the frontier couldn't tolerate. A woman who refused to submit. They'd hang her for hitting him. They might as well hang her for finishing it. Thomas woke furious. She could hear him through the barn walls, shouting threats that turned her blood to ice. What he'd do to her. How he'd make her pay. The creative, horrific ways he'd ensure she regretted fighting back. Margaret waited until dark. Then she took the Winchester. She'd found where he hid the ammunition and walked to the barn. "Thomas," she called through the door. "You bitch," he snarled. "You think you can lock me in my own barn? When I get out of here, I'm going to give you a choice." Margaret interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll let you go. I'll take one horse, enough supplies to reach the next territory, and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Tell people whatever story you want. I was crazy, I ran off, whatever keeps your pride intact. Or what? Or I make sure you never threaten another woman again." Thomas laughed. "You don't have it in you. You're not a killer." Margaret cocked the rifle. "I wasn't, but you made me one." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. In that moment, she truly didn't know what she'd do. Murder wasn't something she'd ever imagined herself capable of. But standing there listening to this man who'd tried to own her, who'd reduced her to property, she felt something cold and clear settle over her. She wasn't a killer, but she was a survivor. And sometimes on the frontier, those were the same thing. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas said, his voice changing, calmer, calculating. "You're going to unlock this door. We're going to go inside. You're going to cook dinner like nothing happened. And tomorrow we'll ride into town together. I'll tell them you had a spell, that you're not well. We'll find someone to help you. A doctor, maybe. Somewhere you can rest." Margaret understood. He was planning to have her committed. Locked away in an asylum where frontier judges sent inconvenient women. Where she'd disappear into paperwork and stone walls. "Come on, Margaret. Be reasonable. You're tired, you're scared. You made a mistake. But I'm willing to forgive." She shot him through the door. The rifle's crack echoed across the empty prairie like thunder. Inside the barn, silence. Then a body hitting the ground. Margaret stood frozen, the rifle smoking in her hands. Part of her expected Thomas to start shouting again, proving she'd missed. But there was only quiet. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Now came the hard part. Margaret opened the barn door slowly, the Winchester still raised. Thomas lay on his back, eyes open, a neat hole in his chest. Dead. Definitely dead. She should have felt remorse, horror, guilt. Instead, she felt exhausted. And something else, something that scared her more than the murder itself. Relief. But relief wouldn't protect her. What she needed now was a story. A good one. Because in 3 days the supply wagon was scheduled to pass through. The driver would stop, ask for Thomas, wonder where he was. And Margaret needed an answer that wouldn't end with her hanging. She couldn't hide the body. Someone would eventually find it. She couldn't burn the ranch and claim an accident, too obvious. She couldn't run. She'd freeze before reaching the next town, which left only one option: tell the truth. Just not all of it. Margaret worked through the night. She dragged Thomas's body back to the house, positioned it in the bedroom, and then, with a brutality that surprised her, she shot him twice more. Once in the shoulder, once in the leg, then she shot herself. Not fatally. Margaret wasn't suicidal, but she pressed the rifle's muzzle against her left arm, gritted her teeth, and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through muscle and exited clean. The pain was blinding but necessary. She bandaged herself roughly, then arranged the scene. Thomas on the floor by the bed. Blood spattered on the walls. The Winchester nearby. Shell casings scattered. Signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, broken glass. Then she sat on the porch and waited for dawn, rehearsing her story. Raiders came at night. 3, maybe 4 men. They wanted money, supplies. Thomas fought them. I grabbed the rifle. There was shooting. Thomas went down. I hit one of them, I think, but they ran. By the time I could check on Thomas, he was gone. It was believable. Raids weren't uncommon. The wound on her arm would prove she'd been in the fight. The multiple bullet wounds would explain why Thomas couldn't have survived to contradict her story. As the sun rose, Margaret dug the grave. Because that's what survivors did. They buried the evidence. They moved forward. They lived. The supply wagon arrived right on schedule. The driver, a man named Cal Brewster, took one look at Margaret, arm bandaged, face hollow with exhaustion, and immediately believed her story. "Jesus, ma'am. You should have ridden for help." "I couldn't leave him," Margaret said, voice cracking in exactly the right places. I thought if I kept pressure on the wounds." Cal helped her fill in the rest of the grave. He rode into town, returned with the marshal, a gray-haired man named Tate who'd seen too much to be surprised by violence. Marshal Tate studied the scene, asked careful questions, examined the blood patterns. Margaret answered everything honestly. The truth was in the details: the overturned chair, the broken window, her wounded arm. What she didn't mention was the hours in between. The choice in the barn, the calculated staging. "These raiders," Tate said finally. "You get a look at them?" "Dark, it was too dark. I just shot where I saw movement." Tate nodded slowly. "We've had reports. Gang working the territory. Usually hit isolated ranches. Most victims don't survive to tell about it." He looked at her with something like respect. "You're lucky, Mrs. Caldwell." Margaret met his eyes. "I don't feel lucky. They buried Thomas in town with a proper service." Margaret wore black and kept her expression appropriately grieved. Neighbors she'd never met offered condolences. Women brought food. Men offered to help work the ranch until she figured things out. She sold the property within a month. Took the money and bought passage on the first stage heading west. She didn't stay for the investigation Tate promised to conduct. Didn't wait to see if her story would hold, because she knew something the marshal didn't. On the frontier, stories mattered more than truth. And she'd told a story people wanted to believe. But on her last night before leaving, something happened that changed everything. Margaret was packing her few belongings when she heard a horse outside. She grabbed the rifle, always the rifle now, and peered through the window. A man dismounted in the moonlight, tall, wearing a long coat, hat pulled low. For one impossible, terrifying moment, her mind whispered, "Thomas." But that was impossible. She'd buried Thomas herself, watched them lower him into Montana earth. The man knocked. Margaret approached the door slowly, rifle ready. "Mrs. Caldwell?" The voice was unfamiliar. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late. My name is William Hartley. I'm a federal marshal out of Helena. I need to speak with you about your husband's death." Margaret's heart stopped. Federal marshal. Not local law, but territorial authority. The kind of man who could investigate properly, who might uncover what she'd done. She opened the door slowly. "It's late, Marshal, I know. But I've been riding for 3 days to get here. May I come in?" What choice did she have? She stepped back, keeping the rifle visible but not raised. Marshal Hartley removed his hat, revealing a weathered face with intelligent eyes. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Caldwell. Your husband's death. The official story is raiders. But I've investigated 3 similar cases in the past year, all isolated ranches, all attributed to raiders, and all the victims were men with questionable reputations regarding their wives." Margaret's throat went dry. "I don't understand what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Hartley sat without being invited. "Thomas Caldwell was known in Helena. Had business there before he married you. Got into a dispute with a woman who worked in a boarding house. She ended up dead. Fell downstairs officially, but there were whispers. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't. That's how men like Thomas work. They move territories, start fresh, find new victims." Hartley leaned forward. "I've seen your wound, Mrs. Caldwell. I've seen the scene. And I've seen staging before." The silence stretched like a rope about to snap. Margaret's mind raced through options. Deny everything, admit nothing, shoot him if necessary. But something in Hartley's eyes stopped her. "Are you here to arrest me?" she asked finally. "No." "Then why are you here?" Hartley pulled out a worn notebook, flipped through pages. "In the past 18 months, 7 women in Montana Territory have been widowed under suspicious circumstances. 6 claimed raiders. 1 claimed her husband fell from his horse. In every case, the husband had a history. Violence against women, unpaid debts to prostitutes, assault charges that disappeared when witnesses suddenly left town." He looked at her directly. "You're not the first woman who fought back, Mrs. Caldwell. You're just the first one I've found while she's still alive to talk about it." Margaret's legs felt weak. "What happens now?" "That depends. I can file a report, start an official investigation, drag you through territorial court where a jury of 12 men who think like your husband, will decide if you had the right to defend yourself. Or, or I write in my report that I interviewed you, found your story credible, and recommend no further action. The case gets filed away. You move west like you're planning. And maybe, just maybe, the next woman who finds herself in your situation will know she can fight back. That someone in authority won't automatically assume she's the criminal. Margaret stared at him. Why would you do that? Because I had a sister once. She married a man who killed her slowly over 10 years. Broken bones, bruises she hid, silence she learned to keep. When she finally tried to leave, he shot her in their kitchen. He claimed self-defense, said she attacked him with a knife. The jury believed him. He served 2 months and walked free. Hartley's voice cracked slightly. I can't save every woman on this frontier, Mrs. Caldwell, but I can stop hunting the ones brave enough to save themselves. Margaret left Montana that winter. She traveled west, taking different names in different towns, working as a schoolteacher in Oregon, a bookkeeper in California. She never married again. Never stopped looking over her shoulder, but she also never regretted that night. The night she became a killer. The night she chose survival over submission. The night she learned that sometimes the only law on the frontier was the one you wrote yourself in blood and necessity. Years later, working in a San Francisco boarding house, Margaret would hear stories of women who'd fought back, wives who'd shot husbands in self-defense, widows whose stories had too many convenient holes. Each time she'd wonder if Marshall Hartley had found them too. If he'd offered them the same quiet mercy, she never knew for certain. But she hoped, because on the frontier justice wasn't always what was legal. Sometimes it was just what was necessary. And sometimes the bravest thing a woman could do was break every rule and live to tell about it, even if the telling was always a lie. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice on the frontier, hit that subscribe button. We have more tales of courage, violence, and the thin line between victim and vigilante waiting for you. And if this story made you question what you'd do in Margaret's place, leave a comment below, because every one of us, given the right pressure, becomes capable of the impossible. Now click on the video on screen to hear another story from the Wild West, one where the line between hero and outlaw disappears completely, and what remains will haunt you long after the campfire dies.